Welcome to Neurosalience, the OHBM podcast.
Welcome to the Organization for Human Brain Mapping Neurosalience podcast. I'm Peter Banatini, and here I discuss all things brain imaging with scientists around the world. Today on this episode, I'm excited to talk with Mallar Chakravarty all about the imminent relaunch of the journal Aperture Neuro, which a few years ago was created and supported through OHBM. Sometime last year, it was clear that the platform we chose to support Aperture Neuro was completely inadequate. So we decided to shut it down, regroup, find a new platform, modify the editorial team, and relaunch. Mallar and I, along with members of the Aperture Oversight Committee, saw this through, and in the process received quite an education. While Mallar was handling the loose ends of Aperture Neuro, he was also serving as chair of the OHBM program committee for the upcoming meeting in Montreal, as well as leading his computational brain anatomy laboratory at the Cerebral Imaging Center, which is affiliated with McGill University. His studies focus primarily on brain anatomy, how it matures, how it ages, and how alterations are related to neurodegenerative disorders such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, as well as schizophrenia. He has also produced and disseminated many useful tools, atlases, and data sets. So he's clearly a rising star and a leader in the field, and his work positions him well to have the broad perspective that's useful to leading this journal. Well, I'm starting out as editor-in-chief of Aperture Neuro, hoping to bring on board my past experience with neuroimage. Mallar will be taking over as editor-in-chief when I step down. So in this podcast, we discuss what happened with the first version of Aperture Neuro, what lessons were learned, and what the relaunched version of Aperture Neuro offers that is truly unique and valuable to the field. It's nonprofit and open access with an APC of $800 for members. It provides an avenue for many different kinds of papers, from typical original research to editorials, tutorials, conference summaries, book reviews, registered reports, and more. It will be heavily weighing the assessment of submitted papers based on their utility and transparency rather than just their novelty. In the future, Aperture Neuro aims to seamlessly support other objects, such as code, data, notebooks, and videos, and is currently looking into mechanisms for handling these without compromising on quality or efficiency. I hope you enjoy it. Just to start out a little bit, I've been working with Mallar for a number of years as far as working through all the issues in terms of the previous version of the journal and this one. And just to frame things a little bit to begin, just to talk a little bit about Mallar. As I don't know exactly when your name came up. I think Tanya, when she was editor-in-chief, she invited you to come on to help her out. And I think that it became very quickly realized that that you're pretty much the, sort of like the perfect person to head this up. And I think that, in other contexts, I've had to, looking at your work and other things like that, it seems that, the way I picture your work and the way your interests is, it's exactly at sort of like the nexus of the field. I mean, of the entire field. I think that, you do, your focus is more on computational neuroanatomy, but you work with mouse models, animal models. You work with fMRI. You do basic research. You build tools. You build databases, and you work with clinical applications. So that pretty much covers almost everything. And on top of that, you have experience with being a handling editor with Neuroimage, which is great experience and a great perspective of their culture of editors, which is outstanding. Your work is, I just have to mention this right now. I was actually, just doing some of my research a little bit. As I've known you, I've worked with you as well, but um, and not that these things are important, but they are into at some level. Is that I just put you into Google Scholar, and your citations are just it's just amazing. It's like you start from zero at around 2010, and now it's like this exponential increase up to 44,000 citations last year.
Yeah.
And so it's been your very high impact work, and also, and I've had so much fun. I've really appreciated working with you as well. I feel lucky as far as that's concerned.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I can only say I've really loved working with you. It's been such a learning curve, which I think we'll get into in this podcast as well, on how to start a journal and what that even means, because I think that's almost something interesting for the community to know. And I can only be mildly or extremely embarrassed by that wonderful introduction. Thank you very much.
It's all true. So yeah, so why don't we get started with Aperture Neuro? It first started 2021, right before the Glasgow
Yeah.
OHBM meeting. The initial version of Aperture Neuro started way before that. I remember being approached by Jean-Baptiste Pauline. He had this vision of starting a open source, open access publishing platform, as he calls it, to publish other objects, not only PDFs, but sort of to break that mold and sort of to open things up. And we're still holding on to that vision, but obviously, as we'll talk about today, there's practical realities that we're trying to work with, and what we first and foremost want to do is make a really well-functioning journal, and then grow from there.
Yeah, I think the vision of having this journal platform that doesn't just support PDFs, but supports the real type of things that make neuroimaging such an interesting field, right? I mean, you're a physicist, I'm an engineer. We're here talking about, brain anatomy, brain function, and I think it's very unique that we have this field that's led by, not just psychologists and neuroscientists, but also that has this give and take with the more technical side of things. And I think, to me, that's always something I've loved. And you can even taking a bigger step back, if you look at kind of how people view neuroimaging, I think we're often considered to be kind of pioneers in cultural aspects of science, right? So which I think is really important. So whether it's open science, inclusivity, data sharing, that kind of thing, people kind of hold us on this pedestal, showing off what we've done and how it can impact science. So I think having a journal that actually reflects that is really important. So how do you give credit for data sharing? How do you give credit for writing code? I think that's a really important aspect of what we do. And it's there in some journals, but it's not so explicit, I don't think. So I was really excited when Tanya White contacted me. It must have been, the pandemic years are a bit of a blur, but it must have been in around 2021. And her vision she was the editor-in-chief at the time, and her vision for Aperture Neuro was really to have kind of real community engagement, so that there were nice term limits for every aspect of things. And so her term limit would expire, and then I would come in as the incoming editor-in-chief so there'd be some overlap, and so we could kind of train people who are coming in the next stages. And so, unlike other journals and a lot of other journals, even journals that are kind of newer to our field now, no one on our editorial board at any level is getting paid, right? All this stuff is really volunteer work in the truest sense of the word. There's just us wanting to do good. So they find members of the community who want to do this very much altruistically is, I think, a real really highlights kind of how our field is, and the support that different members of our field believe is important for moving things forward. So yeah, Tanya brought me in, and through some of the challenges that we had kind of bringing the journal together in terms of, I think staffing is a hard part, finding someone to actually be a journal manager, and that became apparent pretty early. And the reason for that is simple. I think if you're a big publishing house, one of the ones that gets talked about in the media a lot these days, for example. You have a roster of journal managers and staff that basically can run the show. So we have to develop that from scratch. Everything from who's going to help us contact authors, reviewers, remind people for the reviews, that kind of thing, answer queries from authors, especially when so much of the editorial board is really doing this out of the goodness and kindness of the time they have kind of crafted into their schedule for this type of work. All the way from that to basic communication things, to things like making sure that there's no plagiarism involved in any of the submissions, making sure that accepted manuscripts get typeset properly, moving those in a workflow from accepted article to typesetting to proofs to onto a website. I mean, I think it's easy to take for granted just how much work that actually is. And so I think in the platform that we initially started in, I don't think, and I think a lot of people who've been around Aperture Neuro would agree that it wasn't necessarily well equipped for handling this stuff. And so moving to kind of a better equipped platform, which is now hosted by Scholastica, which I think we're all really happy about, is one of the major changes that we've had. And so I think we identified these problems early on. We started investigating platforms, I would say correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, last fall?
Yeah, I think end of summer last fall.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that this whole process of we finally collectively, and also just to mention myself, I was part of what's called the Aperture Oversight Committee when Tanya left. She started up at the NIH. She has which was more time consuming. Suddenly a more time consuming thing. So she stepped down. There was some shifting around. Tom Nichols is in charge of the oversight committee, and I'm the editor in chief for a while, just to try to bring my experience from neuroimage, at least perspective, to help out, and then Mallar will take over. But just to, there was a whole process also of us sort of coming to terms with, I think all of us are problem solvers, and with our own labs and whatever, we try to fix what we have and work with what we have, and we're all struggling with this platform and doing the best we can, and realizing it just at some point we had to sort of all collectively realize, hey, this isn't working.
Yeah.
And then finally,
That sounds about right. And then I just think the amount of work that goes into finding a new platform, that's the fascinating part to me, right? I didn't, it sounds, this, I don't know how this sounds to like the casual viewer of us, like evaluating platforms in our copious amounts of spare time. But it was fascinating to me, actually. It was fascinating to me that there's this whole other world out there of people thinking about how to help people publish at all different types of scale, right? I mean, from the major publishing houses all the way down to people who just who have a nice product that they want to sell and help academics communicate with each other, because that's effectively what this is all about, right? And so I was really surprised at just the breadth of stuff that was out there and what they can and can't do. I think that was really fascinating to me. And just the trade-offs between the different platforms, without getting into like naming names and but we did do an extensive search, and it is fascinating just how we take for granted, I think, as academics, when you upload something onto a website, what kind of service that actually means, right? And so trying to recreate that in a small scale is not trivial, even if you are problem solvers.
Yeah, and it was sort of an education in terms of, as we sort of started thinking of platforms, we started thinking more carefully about, okay, so what really are our needs? I mean, what specifically do we want? And we realized that things like, having a smooth workflow that's transparent and easy to work with in terms of, how the editors communicate, how what the experience is for the authors. Is it smooth? Is it all done through the website? We even had a consultant that was hired that really knew her stuff, give us at least, a little bit better perspective as to what was out there. It was truly it's funny. I've been with neuro, when I was neuroimage, you just sort of jump in and suddenly the papers come and you work with the website and it's like, this is great. Um, but this was really an education in terms of,
Yeah.
what goes on behind the curtains.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of feel like we deconstructed the process into every bit of minutia that you could, which was, again, fascinating in a lot of ways, right? And I think without having gone through that, I don't think it's, and maybe we can talk about this, maybe some of the, I mean, sorry, I don't want to leave the podcast. It's your podcast,
Yeah,
but
you can speak whenever you want to.
but maybe one of the things we can talk about is some of the goals of Aperture outside of just being a publishing platform run by OHBM, because I think it's not until you see what it means to engage with every part of that process that you realize that with some of the goals of Aperture Neuro, which is to not just host traditional PDFs. I guess there's two: not just host traditional PDFs, and two would be to keep the article publishing cost way down. And so, it's worth, we should mention this at the beginning, is that the article publishing cost is 800 USD per paper, right? Which is, well below anything else that's adjacent to our field in terms of open access publishing.
Yeah, and just to emphasize there, the goal is to be just sustainable.
Yeah.
We're not, nonprofit or anything like that. It's just simply to have the lowest amount that will pay for the platform, pay for the journal manager, and that's pretty much, and other costs associated with other things like, copy editing and plagiarism checking and things like that. So
yeah, I think that's really important, right? Like when we talk about not for profit, we really are not for profit, and there's not a dime kind of going anywhere else except for into journal related activities. So I think that's very unique, I think, on any scale. And then the other thing I think is that, if we're talking about supporting code or data sets or notebooks in a dynamic or static way, what that actually might mean. And I don't think it's, how do we support those, or videos even, how do we support those properly so that they're sustainable for the community, so that there's standards by which things are presented to the community, and the obvious checks on authenticity, quality, and things like that. So not trivial. I think one thing that's also worth mentioning is that in recognition of all that, after having seen how challenging it is to just serve the basic stuff, one idea that you had was to bring on Renzo Huber, and I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Just to couch that. So one thing that's unique about Aperture Neuro is that it offers a pretty, what we're trying to do is offer a pretty wide range of what you can submit. So everything from not only the original research, but review articles, even book reviews, tutorials, conference workshop summaries, registered reports, editorials, even about papers or whatever, and replication studies, among those. So, and the other goal that we're, once again, with the original idea of Jean-Baptiste Pauline is to really support other objects from code, data, notebooks, even videos. And that's still a work in progress. Right now, our idea is right now it's basically having still a traditional PDF that has links to where those things reside. But so we've hired one of the editors of the journal, and we should probably introduce who the editors are. But before we do that, one of the editors is Renzo Huber. He's a physicist. He's an expert in high resolution, high field imaging, but he's also extremely energetic and innovative, and he really wants to. He's sort of put in charge of trying to figure out the best way of supporting other objects, and there's once again, as Mallar, as you mentioned, there's a lot to that. We can't really we don't have any, large, we haven't paid for large data spaces for saving the data. Um, and at the same time, also, like, how do you, like you mentioned, how do you review the code? I mean, will this be just links to GitHub or things like that? Or how will we describe it? And how will we review how we describe it, or even the code itself? How deeply do you review the code? We have special code reviewers. Um, do you have to, try it out on data sets or things like that? So we're still kind of working through this process. There's some possible discussion of having other, not really preprint servers, but sort of like having other repositories sort of work with us in that regard. So it is all sort of a work in progress, and Renzo is sort of leading the way on that.
While it's still a work in progress, I think it's like it's still exciting that we're thinking about that, and I think and wanting to do it properly for the community. And the first journal that I've heard of that has this kind of editor that's solely focused on how we expand, how do we do more for the community, and I think that's like a really exciting feature of what we're hoping to do here, and I'm very proud of that. I think it's very exciting.
Yeah, 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 and I think actually also right. That's an important thing too. Is that there's many journals associated with the field and sort of loosely associated with the community, but this journal, right, has started through the community, and we're constantly getting feedback, and we really want it to be sort of growing from, sort of taking that same sort of vibe from the community, this special sort of sense that you have all these disciplines, we're all talking to each other, we're all applying what we know to understanding the brain, clinical applications, and so there's this this feeling that when you go to OHBM of this sense of this vibrancy, and we're trying to create a journal that reflects that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a nice description. I like that a lot, because it is an exciting time. Like, it's kind of like one of the times I think it was in Rome when I went to OHBM. Someone said that OHBM was really just summer camp for adult nerds, and it really
Yeah.
just and it just, or adult summer camp for nerds or something like that. And how do you translate that feeling into a journal? I feel like that's a good way of thinking about what we're trying to do here.
Yeah.
Making it exciting and dynamic, and a place for learning, right? Not just for prestige publication, for example.
Yeah, and also right, a place where we're a little bit closer to trying new things, but very carefully. One lesson, one hard lesson that we've learned is that we can't try to do too much too soon. Things sometimes fall apart, and so we have to be very, we're and I think, Mallar, you've emphasized this several times, is that we had to shut down, now we're starting up, and we really, really have to get this right. And we
Yeah,
really,
yeah. Yes. And I'm very committed to that as well. And I know you are too. No, and I'd like to get it right, and I'd like, I'd like this to be the go-to venue for neuroimaging research in the coming years, right? I mean, that's our goal. And neuroimaging research writ large, right? And in all the ways we just described, not just, here are my cool new findings, but here's how we got to the findings. Here's the code, and we have, for example, one of the things that I quite liked in our previous incarnation was we had a bunch of papers written about, or a bunch of editorials written about the BWAS article, from varying viewpoints, right? Some very positive, some very negative, and everything in between, or some just discussion oriented as well, right? And they're on the website now and should be perused. And I think if people want to think about what type of objects that we can support, it can be something as simple as that, right? It can be, how do we get a community perspective on some of these papers that are currently hot in the field and that are driving discussion, in our corridors, at our coffee breaks and whatever. So how do you bring that to the journal? And people are by and large really excited to do that. When we asked around for the authors to write up those, yourself included, write up those editorials. I think we didn't get very many no's, and I was quite. It's quite exciting to see how many people wanted to take on commenting on that manuscript, because
Yeah.
it had such a wide ranging impact, media wise, academically, even in different. I remember getting emails from different um, uh, from different. So now I live near a church, and I don't know if you can hear the church bells. It's very ominous. Sorry, this will end in a few moments. But yeah, no, I was really enthusiastic. It was the enthusiastic response we got was really really nice. So I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, and one can imagine, and this is actually, and this is something that we're a little bit more flexible in terms of, one can imagine, right? Like you said, that BWAS article caused a lot of discussion. You can imagine having, you know, special issues just focused around people writing their opinions on debating, specific issues as they come up. And
Yeah, yeah.
uh,
No, I think that'd be, and I think yeah, and that's what the conference is for. That's what our community does really well, actually, and respectfully too, right? It's not, we've all been to other meetings where, you almost get an eye roll when certain people come to the podium or the microphone to ask questions, and I don't think we have that as much in our community. And I think having that kind of respectful engagement and discussion about the merits of different articles and different academic lines of thinking is exciting, right? I mean, that's what you want. You want a conversation to happen.
it's interesting because as I look at OHBM, it looks like things have shifted a little bit. I mean, I think that certainly there's always this, but it's become extremely young. It's become very, a lot of people are analyzing other people's data, using other people's code, in novel ways. But still, there's just much more of a interconnectedness, realizing that you can't just, come up with you can, what people still do, but it's not just simply, oh, I got this novel finding, I'm going to push it and argue for this sort of thing. And it's more, of course there's that exists, but at the same time, there's more, oh, is this reproducible? Um, is this believable? How does this integrate with other modalities? How can we lend insight into models that sort of tie into this? So it's very much interconnected. And I think one of the things, I think we could talk about this as well, is with the journal. And that's one thing we want to emphasize is that, while other journals emphasize just novel findings and they weight their papers on, oh, how novel is this? And we still think that's important. But, um, you know, we also, and we just, we're still thrashing this out, but it became clear that what we really care about is not only novelty, but utility and transparency and ease of dissemination. That will be rated highly in this journal as well.
Yeah,
So,
your replication, reproducibility, all those things, right? And which is why things like software notebooks become extremely important, right? Or even thinking about, someone mentioned this the other day. Here's a novel finding from another journal that uses neuroimaging data, but there's nowhere to actually tell people about the workflow, right? I mean, one of my biggest pet peeves in publishing is that, you start with certain journals start with results and have the methods kind of tacked on at the end as if they don't matter in some cases, right? And
yeah.
exposing those things, I think, is truly important. So
Yeah, and I think actually, but once again, the balance too. I mean, we certainly don't want this journal to become, like purely, there's always a risk of falling into some sort of pattern, like, oh, it's a purely big data meta-analysis journal. We don't want that.
you don't.
We want, everything from one-off experiments, interesting models to everything, in between. And also one thing that's different, I think, in terms of relative to other journals is that, uh, we also, I think, are welcoming, yes, we're a methods journal. Yes, we care about basic research, but we also very much care about clinical applications. So not only from clinical research, but, I think, we'll be open to, um, you know, uh, uh, things like, clinical studies as
Yeah.
well. Um,
Yeah.
so
And I think that's going to be really important because, our community needs a place to look at all that. And even think about where to publish. And this is becoming an increasingly thorny issue, right? There's novelty now, I think, more than ever in publishing negative findings, if you do it right, and when you do it right. So I think there's a lot of openness to that as well, and thinking about that. So especially negative findings in the context of, you know, um, important findings in the field that may have been underpowered or may have been, you know, improperly conducted, and thinking about how we can highlight some of those methodological issues alongside a negative finding, right? I think that's clearly very important, I think, for everyone in science.
yeah, yeah. And I think, right, I think this journal it aims to be the place where these types of things are published and discussed. And, it's sort of like the field getting perspective of itself
Yeah, it's nice. I
through
like that.
this,
Yeah.
through this journal. Uh, yeah. So just to take we'll continue that in a second, but I just want to make sure also that everyone knows, initially, the first iteration of the journal, we had a bunch of, we thought, okay, well, let's try to cover a wide range of expertise in our handling editors. And we had a lot of handling editors. And we realized that model doesn't always work great, because I think that, at least from what I learned in neuroimage, it seems that if you're a little bit busy all the time, it really helps your efficiency and engagement, and it helps create the culture of having everyone talking and working with each other. So what Mallar and I did, and we choosing the editors, is just parse it down. And I'm just gonna, if you don't mind, I'm just gonna
Yeah,
list.
I think it's great. Yeah.
Um, these are the handling editors: Molly Bright, who's does acquisition and physiology; Katie Chang, MR physics, arousal, time series analysis; Valeria Della Maggiore, she's in Buenos Aires. She's does motor learning and structural plasticity, DWI, sleep; Eduardo Garza Villarreal, he's an MD PhD from the National Institute of Neurobiology in Mexico. So we're trying to be very also representative of the international community in the true sense. Uh, uh, Satra Ghosh at the McGovern Institute um, at MIT in Boston. Andreas Horn at Department of Neurology and Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. He's also an MD PhD. Renzo Huber, who we mentioned. Hiromasa Takamura, who does vision neuroscience and also DTI applications. And also, our recent Young Investigator Award winner at OHBM. He's in Japan, Osaka University. Sophie Vaughn, who's a up and coming, or maybe pretty established, but up and coming researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences in Leipzig. She does genetics and developmental structural and functional MRI, DTI, and then finally Thomas Yao, who most of you know about. He's created his atlas. He's in Singapore. He focuses on brain parcellation, machine learning, connectivity. So those are the people, and that's at least the range of expertise that we're trying to cover. And we're flexible. I think that if we find that there's gaps, we might add an editor. If we find there's too much redundancy, we might take some away. Who knows? So the whole thing is to find synergy, and all these people are clearly well known in the field and very engaged.
Yeah. And I also think that some of these people were working on the first iteration of the journal. Some of them are new based on the gaps that we identified in that first iteration of the journal. And also, again, I think we did some, heavy consultation with our oversight committee. And the oversight committee, I think, is something that makes this quite unique, because it is oversight from OHBM, in the academic sense. And so there are, and you can look this up on the website as well. We should probably even say it, apertureneuro.org, which is
Oh
where you
yeah,
can go. Apertureneuro.org, which is where you can go and
all one word, apertureneuro.org. Yep.
yeah, um, which is where you can go and look at kind of what we're trying to do, what we're trying to accomplish, where you can submit papers, and who is working for the journal. But the oversight committee is an interesting one because it's people that are there just to make sure that, one, we're doing our job, two, that we represent the community properly and well, and not just from an academic sense, but this kind of geographic diversity perspective as well, and that people who are coming from all over the place geographically are represented in the journal. That was actually one of the nice I don't know if you remember this last year. We had a Aperture Neuro roundtable, and definitely we had some people who were at the Glasgow meeting who came up to, I think, both of us after the meeting and said, like, "Oh, finally a place I can afford to publish in and still get credit for it from my university." And that was really heartwarming to hear, right? I mean, it's not just for those of us sitting in North America and Europe who can kind of who have some money to spend on publication, but how do we help those who want to disseminate knowledge? We're doing fantastic work, but in under-resourced areas, and all the resources are going to the science. How do they resource, paying 3, 4, 5,000 USD for a publication? That's probably a number of PhD students in a lab sometimes
Yeah.
in some places, right? So it's hard to justify that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's always interesting because when people talk about open access, they think, "Oh, this is great! It's open access. It's free for everyone." But the money comes from somewhere, and in some weird ways, open access is actually more restrictive in terms of if a lab can't afford to publish in open access, then it's equally as restrictive as limiting access to the papers. So we're trying to come up with that balance of uh, right. I mean, and not only that, right? We have the $800 for members, $1,000 for non-members, but also, we have a part where we consider, other countries that are
Yeah.
lower income, or even and there's also a little bit of wiggle room in terms of if you're a lab that doesn't have much money, but you might not fall within that range, you can always email us or whatever, and we'll figure something out, because our goal is to actually have it, have more accessibility
Yeah.
in that regard.
Our goal is to help, right? I mean, that's the bottom line. So, I think it's exciting that even the people that have joined, we had a nice meeting with them the other day, and there's just a lot of enthusiasm for getting this new chapter open and ready, and for having people engage. So, I think we're starting on the right foot here. Yeah.
Yeah, and we even we have a new color scheme in our papers with
Yeah.
kind of blue and green sort of, and we other details. We uh, uh, who was it
And
from
you,
the lab that came up with the logo? Some talented artist.
I should mention her name, Cindy Garcia from my lab, who's a PhD student in my lab, and she had as many options as there were hours in the day. It seemed like, and refining them based on the whims and the and the whims of a number of academics who don't do this for a living, but
Yeah.
knew what they liked and were not afraid to say it. So she did a great job, Cindy. So I'm very proud of her, and that this logo kind of is part of her PhD journey too. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, that was sort of fun because it's funny because I would sort of we all sort of tried to come up with logos, and some people would submit some, I submitted some, and then Tom Nichols would be like, "Oh, that's horrible," and I'd be like, "Okay." uh, we're all sort of bouncing this each other against each other, and then Cindy came up with these, and we're like, "Hey, these are pretty good."
Yeah. Yeah, and it was pretty amazing. Like, could you just make it a sagittal view or an axial view or a coronal view? Or what if you did it with, more of a graph representation? And she had an answer for all of that. It was really
Yeah,
impressive. It was really, really impressive. And,
yeah. No, that was great. That was great.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like that sort of captures sort of what we've been doing. Not just the sort of trivial stuff like that, but everything like that has been like bouncing off like how are we going to do this? How are we going to do that? And
Yeah.
so even things like, copy editing or whatever, it's like we have to find a copy editor that works with Scholastica, and then they have sort of a package, and we have to decide, okay, that seems to make sense, and how do we want our copy? It's sort of like it's at some point I was sort of, you know, people are confronted with this when sort of like if they're redoing their kitchen or something, there's too many choices. Um, and so you just don't know, like, I don't know, and it was sort of along those lines, like, typesetting. Do you want, what sort of typesetting do you want?
Yeah.
And we have this sort of thing. And so there's so many decisions that, we had to be sort of guided through, we worked it through and tried to sort of make, there's certain things actually that are just the opposite. Some things we have too many options. There's certain other things
I was gonna
that
say,
we're kind of constrained. Um, the website itself is beautiful, but it's sort of set up in a way that we have to sort of work with. Um, uh, you know, all the information's there, but it's just a matter of and for most people it will be. You won't even notice it, but for us, it's like, oh, why can't we have an extra page for this sort of thing? And
yeah.
it's like, oh, that's how we set it up, and it's like we work with that. So,
Yeah. But even things like migrating our previous papers and the metadata over to a new platform, right? We had to, I won't go into the details, but we had to find some creative ways to, uh, get the metadata out of that previous platform and into our new one, so that these papers are findable. And it's worth mentioning, actually, and this is something we should have mentioned on the top. We're indexed in PubMed now, right? So, if you publish with Aperture Neuro, that paper gets indexed in PubMed. So we're past that kind of early period where new articles in a new journal don't get indexed in PubMed. So these papers are findable by anyone in the scientific community, which I think is really important. And hopefully we can build on that growth to really sustain impact writ large, not in the traditional ways, but all the ways in which we seek to have impact in our community. So
yeah, yeah. So, yeah, exactly. So all these details, and we're sort of we're there. And like I said, we're there's so many things that we're still, like I mentioned, that we're still working on. But at least we're at the stage now where we're ready to get going again. And it's like just to before we end, we have a little bit of time. Like for instance, at some point I wanted to talk about your own work, but uh, we could save that for another podcast because it is so interesting. I mean, you have this great website. I was just looking at your website where you have all these, you have all these atlases that you have, and you have various tools that you have, and other novel findings. How, like, if you're submitting, so with your work,
yeah.
um, uh, you know, what, you know, would there be a situation? And obviously, you're, knowing that we're all biased now because we're part of that, but if you were just from the outside, I mean, I think that people think are like, oh, well, Aperture Neuro isn't really established yet, but I mean, what does it offer that it will be established, it will
Yeah.
grow, it will, and so what sort of aspects of your work that you think would be uniquely tailored or to Aperture Neuro as far as that's concerned?
Yeah. So I think there's almost everything we do can be tailored to Aperture Neuro. I think that's what's exciting to me because, there's so I think my lab is sitting, I come from biomedical engineering background. I work in the Department of Psychiatry at McGill. And so my lab is somewhere, in that dimension across, the methods and the techniques all the way into how you develop novel findings with these novel methods, right? And so a lot of this stuff, for example, one rabbit hole that we've gone down, and you might appreciate this in the last little while, is how do you properly conduct an fMRI experiment in mice? Which is, they're small. There's obvious signal to noise issues. There's potentially anesthesia issues if that's the road you're going down. And if you don't go down the anesthesia road to anesthetize the animals when you're acquiring data, if you do it awake, there's other problems too. We know there's the well-known problems with motion and potentially problems with stress, learned helplessness in the animals. So, in order to work with mice, you have to think like a mouse in some ways, right? So why would you, if you're a mouse, why would you stay still in a scanner for half an hour while the world is kind of exploding around you and you don't know what's going on? So this is something we've been thinking about, and so what does the data look like, in a good data set versus a bad data set? Can we give examples of those data? Can we give code to analyze those data sets with? Things like quality control issues are things that we think a lot about in my lab, and how that might impact not just in functional data sets, but also in structural ones too, and how much those impact downstream findings. So I think that's something that I'm very keen on, and it's something we work really hard on actually so that we can stand by everything that we publish. And we've seen in the field like work by Jonathan Power and Ted Satterthwaite on what does good data look like, is so impactful, and it's so important, probably more important than maybe even they thought it would be when they started working on those things. And so we think a lot about those things too, but then the code that supports it, to find good data sets and cut out bad ones, that would be it. And a lot of our one thing that I'm really proud of, as you mentioned before, is we've been doing a lot of work on kind of treatment response in animal models and how that might integrate with things we see in human populations. And so those are interesting papers, and some of imaging neuroscience I think would be another venue that would support that. But certainly some of the technical aspects of how we actually acquire that data, make the analysis tools, and that side of my lab actually is really interesting. Well, obviously I think it's interesting, but what I find is that unlike the human imaging world, the animal imaging world, we're in this phase where if you want to do some analysis, or if you want to acquire data, you're basically doing it from scratch. Like there's not a lot of there's some, but there aren't a lot of off-the-shelf tools to support all that. So how do you standardize those? There's the recent paper by Joe Grandjean in Nature Neuroscience talking about kind of harmonization, but there's, for every one of those papers, there's still all these little glue pieces that you have to figure out, which might sound familiar to you. So I think all those things are worth exposing so that people can benefit from what we've done. That's just one piece, but I think everything from kind of the more traditional hypothesis-driven research questions that we ask around schizophrenia or Alzheimer's disease, that could be easily something that we would want to have here too, right? So
yeah, I mean, it seems that more, so that's perfect. I mean, I think that you know when you have information that you produce, I mean, sure, you want to emphasize, initially you emphasize how it's novel, but at the same time, to actually have it be useful, it's not just, you can't just read a paper and from that paper and then just do it. I mean, I think that there's other levels of publishing where, like you said, it's like you give sort of a perspective and a tutorial on some of the aspects of how you actually.
that's a great point. And I think that would be that's really critical. I think how do we educate one another on the good stuff we're doing? I think that's like a nice way of thinking about this journal, right?
Yeah.
Not just competing for intellectual primacy or something like that. More about how do we move the field forward together, which I think goes back to this idea of OHBM being really exciting and a place where I think that is the culture around most of the meeting. It's about sharing knowledge, not about trying to declare that this part of the world is mine now because I was the first with this finding. And I think that does, I think, differentiate our community from a lot of other neuroscientific communities, and in a really important way.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that, I mean, right, the field gets moved forward in different ways. Sometimes it is a novel finding that opens things up, but most of the time, if you really want to get traction, it's like you have to ratchet it forward with shared information and shared expertise and shared, this has to be disseminated. Like, I mean, even just a basic thing like, fMRI is wonderful for, looking at brain function and looking at doing research, but aside from a few applications, it's not really a clinically useful thing. And I think part of that is just partially because the methods are, the methods haven't been disseminated enough, and maybe the level of expertise hasn't been spread through. But also, I think that for instance, we're always looking for biomarkers. It's almost a bad word now. He's saying biomarker, but uh, you know, but uh, and there's various studies that do this, and having more of a community that has these tools that can work with their populations, I think will push us forward a little bit more meaningfully than just simply, isolated studies here and there, sort of suggesting something. So
Yeah, but and you're seeing it emerge too, like after decades of having fMRI acquisition, fMRI analysis tools available, in the brain stimulation world, for example, fMRI, across different labs now, not just one or two, um, uh, fMRI is becoming a tool of choice for targeting, right? And that I think is, if you're going to ask what are
yes,
the wins for neuroimaging and functional MRI, that's a huge one, right? That's an
yes,
impact. People are opening clinics based on personalized fMRI signatures, right? Which is probably even 5, 6, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have even imagined. Uh, to me, that's exciting demonstration of where we could be in the next, 5, 10 years. And that's also just taking, in some cases, a common idea like lesion mapping, like championed by Mike Fox, or the individualized connectomes championed by, I guess, Randy Buckner originally, but then moving forward to Andrew Zaleski, and then showing that you could use these as personalized biomarkers for treatment administration. I mean, that's so important.
yeah,
So we're getting there.
yes, yes, yeah, and yeah, certainly. Um, Yeah, and once again, it's really is. It would be nice, it's so much easier if instead of trying to reproduce something from a paper, having the code, having a paper that describes where the code is.
Yeah,
You just get the paper, it's a one, source, and you simply get the code or the data, or try it out and get it. So much of the field is it's a craft. It's like it's a matter of getting the certain expertise, and this we want this. And as you mentioned before, it's like you want this journal to be able to, you're thinking of the field as a whole as opposed to um, you know any one group or any one area. You're
yeah,
trying to push the field itself, and
yeah,
this is the sort of missing ingredient, I feel, in terms of helping that move
yeah.
forward.
No, I mean, exactly. Like these clinical application pieces of code, if they were readily available, that'd be great. If, in any context, same thing with all the bits and pieces that we run in the preclinical side. And then, and even the merging things like imaging transcriptomics has now been around for a little while, but there's so many different flavors of how people can run this stuff. There's, we have choices galore in our field, right? And that's a good thing and sometimes a challenging thing, right? And how we talk about those things is really, really important.
Yeah,
Um, I don't know if we're ever standardized per se, but at least we can be open about what we found when we were doing what we did, um, and what those choices mean. I think that's really exciting. Yeah,
yeah, and ultimately, right, you like and this is why we try to, what we want, like clinicians in on the conversation. You want basic researchers, you want physicists, engineers. um, yeah, and this is a place where they can all exchange this
yeah,
information. Okay, so what do you see as, just the final question, as far as the future directions? We talked a little bit about moving in the direction of obviously better, or trying to actually figure out how to best, and if anyone in the audience that you're listening has some insightful idea in how to best handle code, data, notebooks, whatever, let us know. We're open to suggestions as we're developing these things. So what do you see as uh, uh, sort of the other future challenges, or other future directions? I mean, of course, we're always trying to also talk to people who work with brain hack at
yeah.
OHBM, or maybe NeuroLibre, or other things. But yeah, what do you see as like the challenges going forward?
I think in general, I mean, thinking about the idea of publication comes from when we like would get a magazine in the mail and you'd put it on a shelf and then you'd bind the year's magazines, and then that would be in a library somewhere, right? And so the concept itself, the model itself, is so incredibly outdated, considering we get it on as a PDF, and even the way we used to do review. I mean, it's all based on the idea that like an editor might call you or actually mail you a letter and ask you to review a manuscript, and send you a manuscript in the mail to review, and then you send something like. But it is based on that model, right? And it's just been revamped for the internet. So I think it'd be great to have a model of. I mean, I'm really sticking my neck out here, and this is not going to, for anyone listening, this is not going to be a tomorrow problem, but this is going to be a future problem. Once we get more things up and running, but thinking about, what does a 2023 or a 2025 or 2026 review model of a paper really look like, right? And what does a research object in 2026 really look like? Is it a static thing? Is it a dynamic thing? Is it something that's happening in a series, right? Like you have your initial publication, but then you have a follow-up, or someone else has a follow-up on that initial publication in a real meaningful way. So you actually create lines and, think of threads of research almost that exist on the internet that are interconnected explicitly. And I think we have, but this, as I say this out loud, everybody can see that this is, in terms of service, this is like an incredible problem. So how do we pick apart at least pieces of this so that we can innovate, I think, in terms of publishing, and then continue to be, I think, considered forward-thinking, not just in science, not just in neuroscience or neuroimaging, but in science as a group of people who actually innovated in how we disseminate information. But I think more and more, you've seen other journals think about just the review model, right? eLife is a great example. I think that's such a fascinating, there's varied opinions on that, and there's and it's important to acknowledge that there's probably goodwill on either side of that debate, but but still, I think it still speaks to a need to fundamentally rethink how we spend our time, how we spend our time in order to maximize benefit for science and for each other, right? So that conversations that we have aren't just in the lab, but they're ongoing over time and between labs, and between research objects. I think that's a big problem. It's a big problem to tackle, but I think it's an exciting one to think about as we kind of think about, if we think this as the V1 of Aperture Neuro, is there like a V1.1, 1.2, and 2.0 that really tackle some of these issues? And I think, open to discussion, and I'd love to hear any comments that people have on any aspects of these things. I think, I don't know if that's maybe biting off way too much and committing too much at the end of this podcast, Peter, but I think I do think that's like where, in the ideal world, that's where I'd like to see things going.
Yeah, and I think that, and one thing we've learned though too is that, as mentioned before, is that, I'm all for that as well. I mean, I think everyone has that. This is what's good about this journal, is that we have the flexibility to do this, but at the same time, we've learned the lesson of, we're not going to change things so rapidly that things are lose their functionality. So we're gonna do it very carefully. Yeah. But at the same time, I think all these ideas are on the table.
Yeah.
Things like, other things too, like, right, how do you update a review model? Can we have commentary like attached to the paper? Could we have like some sort of a Reddit sort of upvote, downvote of papers? Have it very organic and community driven. Who knows? We're still grappling with these, and I'm sure there's many experts in the field who could help. So looking into that. So
yeah, I think what we've learned is that every change you make comes with about 1,000 decisions to make alongside that. So that's also worth remembering when we think about these more idealistic models of publication, I think.
Yeah. I mean, there might even, I can imagine, right. It could be modular to some degree. There could be an aperture, but there could be like an aperture beta sort of version that people could.
There we go.
I don't know. I'm getting into trouble just talking about this, but
Yeah, no, this is speaking of like living on the internet, this will live forever and we'll be held accountable. So,
but okay. So, but either way, this has been great. I think you've given, I think that the journal's in great hands with yourself, with the editors. We have a good platform that's solid, that's established, and we're all sort of engaged as far as that's concerned. And yeah, I think that we're all really excited about getting things going again, and what service this could provide to the community. And so yeah, looking forward. Once again, the Aperture Neuro reopening is on July 10th, and go to apertureneuro.org. And also at the website, there's a link somewhere in there that says if you're interested in being a reviewer, you can click on that. You can add your name to the database. And yeah, you can contact Mallar or myself or the journal manager to, if any other ideas or thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, the journal will just scale to the community participation that we get. And that's how we make it our own. I think that's really important to remember.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for spending the time.
Thanks, Peter.
And, I look forward to the future.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks so much for having me here.
All right.
Neurosalience is brought to you by the Organisation for Human Brain Mapping. This week's episode was produced by Alfie Wine and Stefania Asimopoulos.